Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting of the Community and Economic Development Committee to order at 9:01 a.m. We'll start off with our roll call or introductions. I'll start off with my co-chair.
Kevin Gross.
Assembly members?
Christopher Ponce.
Scott Myers.
Karen Bronca.
Anna Brawley.
Do we have any assembly members on the phone?
Yes, you have Randy Salt here.
Thank you, Mr. Salt, and my name is George Martinez, the other co-chair, and we have many people in the gallery today that are going to be presenting, so I'd ask everyone that as you present and speak, just please remember to introduce yourself for the record and speak clearly and identify yourself. We're going to start off with our unfinished business today, and we'll turn it right over to Member Brawley for an update on the AO SB 9 progress.
Yeah, thank you. And we're going to have a brief presentation, and then I'll point everybody to the printout of what is right now an unintroduced draft ordinance that we're going to be talking through. So this is a brief update. As we have talked about before, there was a state law passed in 2022 that made major changes to the state's alcohol laws. Some of that, well, actually a lot of that affects Anchorage, not only businesses, but of course our codes and some of our practices. And so what I've been working with staff and my co-sponsors, Mr. Ponce and Mr. Boland, on a series of ordinances to make those changes. And so what we've been looking at is basically any place in city code that is affected by Senate Bill 9. And so this is the second part of that. There was a ordinance that passed in June, on June 20th, that made changes to the licensing side, and it was not just those state law changes, but really, just a cleanup of our code. So big shout out to Mandy and others who worked on that one to make it cleaner. So now what we're going to be looking at are equivalent changes in Title 21, our land use code, and specifically to the alcohol special land use permit. And so I know Mandy's working on pulling up the presentation. I think the short version is there are not major policy changes in this ordinance. I mentioned before there is interest in talking about things that are not specifically changed in state law, but things like operating hours for our licenses. We don't allow folks to open before 10 a.m. So there's interest in talking about things like that. So those are not as time sensitive, and so we're still working on getting those cleaned up. So maybe while we're doing this, the presentation really goes over the gist of the changes. So I'll just kind of verbally talk through, and then we can catch up. So as I mentioned, there's multiple parts in city code that deal with alcohol licensing. In Title 21, the real specific one is the alcohol special land use permit. Oh, there we go. Close enough. So if you want to scroll down or go to the next page. So again, there's multiple pieces, and then I'm using something I shared in June, but I updated it because I've also discovered or worked on, this will also change some of our penal code, so the chapter 835, and it may have a tiny impact on our alcohol tax administration. So those are things I'm chasing down that are, again, separate from this, but again, lots of changes in state law that affect the city. So, and then the second piece there is really just, again, if you're interested in the Title IV rewrite, AMCO, the Alcohol and Marijuana Control Office, is the agency who's heading that up, working with the Alcohol Beverage Control Board itself. So lots more information there. Next page, please. So just for context, like I mentioned, there was an ordinance that we passed in June. It made changes to some pieces, which is assembly procedures and licenses. And again, it wasn't big policy changes, really just cleanup. And so the piece that we didn't look at before and we're going to look at now is the special land use permit, and specifically the permitting process. But just to say that the special land use permit is another piece that Anchorage-based businesses need to obtain in order to operate here, in addition to a state license. Next page, please. And this is, you can read this in more detail later, but really just clarifying the difference between a license and a land use permit. So the license is state issued. It has to do with your operations of your business. It's renewed every 2 years, and then the key thing is the local government's role is protest during the application process, and that could be renewal, transfer, or a new application. And really, so that's something that when the assembly votes on licenses, we're not approving them. We are either protesting, waiving protest, or what's called conditional protest, which is basically not objecting to the license, but saying, you haven't done your fire inspection, the technical things that need to get done. So the special land use permit, that is something that's in our local code that is issued by the city. It is a type of conditional use permit, which is where there's extra review of a land use before it is allowed to operate, looking at potential impacts to surrounding uses. And then unlike the license that gets renewed, this is a one-time approval. So basically every business that's operating in the city should have had one of these approved. It can be modified if there needs to be changes to it, but essentially it's a one-time deal. And then it's also a place where the local government has more control. So the muni, because it is something not the state but the city specific, that's where you could put additional conditions. If there's really a bad problem, you can pull that special land use permit, which would not allow them to operate in Anchorage. So it's really a tool that isn't used often for that purpose, but is available to the city and partly why it exists. So then to the next piece, and then we're almost through this slide. In this draft ordinance are some changes. I have a bullet list of them there. Essentially, it's minor cleanup, a few references that needed to be updated because of the state law, and then a couple other pieces that we can talk through, including making any conditions on your land use permit available to the public. And then what's not included is it says there is policy changes. It doesn't change the way this process works. It really doesn't change a lot of the mechanics of it. And so it really is cleanup. And then if you go to the last page, that's really just sharing that this is part of a process. And then I realized that this slideshow didn't have enough goofy stuff in it, so I added some clip art. Because the goal is, again, the state law goes into effect January 1st, 2024, so we're working to not have it be a crunch at the last minute, but really get this worked out, and also give staff the ability to do the pieces that they need to do. So then we can turn to the ordinance itself. And I'll also see if there's any questions before we get there. Okay, and then we'll walk through, and again, this is a draft, and so it's not going to be on Tuesday's meeting even for introduction, but just wanted to run it through the channels to help folks catch up as we go. So I'll skip the first page, that's just some whereas clauses. The rest of the ordinance is really, as I said, changes to this code, which is 2103-040, the alcohol special land use permit. So you'll see we add some wording like sale or service, changing the name of permits, and then starting at line 26, this is a piece that was done on the licensing side in the prior ordinance. Basically, January 1st, all of these licenses are going to convert to the new licensing system. So some change names, some change types of license. There's going to be this kind of one-time shift to the new system. And so what this piece says is it will not, that act will not trigger the need for everybody to go back and modify or update their special land use permit, because again, it's a one-time deal, it's already in place, and we're really talking about businesses that are already operating. And so this is partly to give less of a headache to staff, but also just recognizing that what's happening on January 1st doesn't fundamentally impact on land use. So that's that piece. And then it references the automatic conversion definition that was put into the other ordinance. Then the next section, we've got general standards. This mainly is updating the fact that some of the uses listed, like tea room and cafe, are no longer in our land use code. That was changed years ago, and so it's really just a cleanup. And then we changed the word liquor to the word alcohol. And going to the next page, let's see, page 3 is really just wording changes, so I'm going to skip to page 4. So starting on line 8, so this is really a minor change, but really trying to get at the intent of this language. So the current language says, if there's conditions on your land use permit, the business must put a copy of those conditions physically on the wall at the location. And so I think the intent there is to make that available to the public. So we talked about, some businesses weren't aware that was in there. Most businesses actually don't have special conditions on their land use permit. And so essentially we're changing that to require the department to maintain that list because it's something they have already in their files. And then if there is a question from the public, the licensed business shall make those conditions available to the public. So really making sure that they're available. And then I know I've talked with Francis in planning and Mandy at the clerk's office about in the future how we can move to making those more available online. Because we're obviously we do things electronically. That's going to be a process, but at minimum, this really kind of shifts from requiring people to put pieces of paper on the wall, but still keeping that public access. I think the rest of these are really minor on this page, so I'll skip to page 5. Page 5, starting on line 10, adds an exception. So one of the new concepts in the state law is endorsements, which are additions on your license. They could either allow a larger premises, like a golf course could allow service on the entire course through an endorsement, or it allows things like sampling activities, like at a brewery or at a package store. And so we had a discussion about, do these endorsements by themselves change the land use in any fundamental way? Do they have impacts in themselves? And there's also already a requirement that if your premises changes, if you have another room or you add a patio, you still have to go back and modify your land use permit. So there's a way that happens already. So this proposes to not require a business who applies for a new endorsement to go back and have to modify their land use permit. So they're still going to be going through the state process. They may have to go through the licensing approval process, but really not also triggering a change to this. And then again, if it does change their premises, that's already covered in the code. And so they would have to go back and modify, and that would be true regardless of whether these endorsements exist or not. So that was a policy proposal. Because again, the goal with all of these is that there is a process, that the public looks at it, the local government looks at it, folks like the police and other agencies do, but not to unduly burden the business with something that really is extra, an extra step for something that's not going to really get additional public benefit. And then we're almost done. So number 8 there, expiration. The change here is really not materially changing the principle of it, but giving the planning department something that's tangible that they can look at. So this is dealing with expiration of land use permits. And so if you sell the business to another person, but it's still the same bar, the same restaurant, that the land use permit can run with that business. However, if you transfer the license off of that premises, or it expires, or the license expires, things like that, then there are certain situations where the land use permit also expires. It doesn't exist forever. And so the way that this would, this basically changes the mechanism that makes it expire from things that are really difficult to measure that the planning department wouldn't know, like when the business actually closed, to using the expiration of the license itself from, which is information we get from AMCO. So really just making that a little bit easier, another cleanup piece. And then the last, not the last, but the last thing on this page, this is again dealing with expiration. We're proposing removing this language on the bottom. So there are situations where it would expire, for example, if it was a bar and now it turns into a daycare or something like that. Maybe that's extreme, but that's something where the land use permit would also expire if it's a substantially different use, excuse me. But this last one, it says a change from a business which meets the requirements of the Alcohol Beverage Control Board statutes and regulations for a restaurant designation permit to one that doesn't. The restaurant designation permit is going away. It's changing to an endorsement. But this basically seemed redundant to the things that endorsement or restaurant designation permit covers, like hours of operation, which is already in that list. So it just seems like a redundant piece of the code. And then the last page with content, this is our fees for these changes to these special land use permits. So this is really just changing the names of the licenses consistent with what's changing in state law, and then dealing with the fact that endorsements, because these fees are calculated on square footage of your premises, the endorsements do change that, and so just making sure that when calculating the fee, the endorsements are considered in that. because again, it can make a big difference. So other than that, there isn't a material change to the concept of rezoning fees. And there is still a cap, so even if you are a very large premises, you're not paying $20,000 for this, there's a maximum. And so with that, I think that's all that's in this ordinance, and so happy to take questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Member Brawley. When do we expect this should come to the body?
So I'm aiming to, unless we run into something weird, I'm aiming to introduce it on the 26th and then public hearing on October 10th. And then that would give the planning department plenty of time to update things like their forms.
Excellent. So I just wanted to make sure we all heard that so that the members can take what this presentation offered today, continue to digest this. I appreciate that you all brought it forward and follow up with our next meeting or utilize the open spaces that we have to ask questions that you may have, or prepare for any amendments or additions that you may see necessary.
Yeah.
Thank you for the work.
And if I could share one more quick thing too, if folks do have questions about how this works or how the licensing side works, please do talk to Mandy and talk to Francis, because they're the staff who manage that and are the experts.
Member Brown?
Oh, I just wondered if on page 4, the D at the top where you would make conditions available to the public at request, what's an example of that? I'm just ignorant on what you would be posting as an exception.
I will phone a friend to Francis, because I think maybe just giving an example of a business that has conditions.
Well, I think the idea, the intent behind this language is that if, I don't know, somebody wanted to question whether or not they had the legal right to sell alcohol, they could ask the manager at a restaurant for a copy of the alcohol special land use permit.
Okay.
I don't think it really ever happens, but I don't know, say there was a problem, package store, and there were special conditions on it about what time they had to close or something like that. And a community council president could walk into that problem operator and say, yo, where's the, show me your approval, how late are you guys allowed to be open? And if it said that they had to close at midnight, but they were staying open until 3 a.m., then they could, the public would have access to that, or to make a report to land use enforcement about a violation of their approval.
Okay. Can I ask one more question? I saw recently about the mobile bar. How does that fit into here? There was, maybe they don't actually have alcohol on it, but the party, the host.
We saw that as well and sent that article in the paper to AMCO, and they're talking with the owner and reviewing it. Mandy, do you have anything to add?
No, the only thing, reading the article, it sounded like they weren't planning on operating within the municipal boundaries. It was all gonna be outside on like the road system.
It was confusing because they said their home base was Anchorage.
Right, but they wouldn't actually be operating within Anchorage is what it appeared from the article, so.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. Please identify yourself for the record.
I'm Francis McLaughlin in the planning department.
All right, thank you. We're going to
I
continue.
have a question on that.
Yes.
Mandy, sorry, Chris Helpson, do you know why is it a code issue where the mobile bar wouldn't be allowed in Anchorage? Or, because remember we had a conversation last year about the people with that pedal bike proposal, and effectively AMCO told us that wasn't legal, and so, do you know?
There has to be a land use permit for the alcohol within Anchorage. We have to have like a set.
So it is a muni
location.
code issue.
I believe so. I don't think there's any restriction on state to allow for like a mobile alcohol license, right? Or is that one of the changes in SB9?
I think historically premises have had to be a building with a foundation, but I don't know if that's, I
thought
think
that
that's
was state
generally,
law,
yeah.
not local law.
Right.
Well, our requirements with Title 21 kind of make it the same.
Okay, this is an area to investigate. It's very interesting because that family's business is an interesting idea, but they were shut down at the state, not by the meeting.
Yeah. I think the bottom line with alcohol in Alaska is a lot of innovative things that you see in other states have not been allowed here or may still not be allowed here, and so it's common to go and see, oh, that's cool, I wonder why we're not doing that. It's usually because of state law, so. But the goal with the Title IV rewrite is to give more flexibility.
Great, and the goal with this ordinance is to bring the municipality in line with state regulations.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone for that conversation. We're going to move on to item B, our quarterly dashboard development services update. Craig Lyons, are you going to be the person?
I'm going to
present?
start it, I guess. Craig Lyon, Planning Department. I believe that Mr.
Can
Shitty
you all
broke
come a
me
little
into
closer?
this. So, but I'm just going to start. I believe the concept at one of your previous meetings was you wanted to have a dashboard that tracked how development was going, how many permits, all that sort of stuff.
Yes.
We don't track that in our department. I think Ross has probably more information on that. What we do track, and I share the PVRs, the performance measures that we do track, they're just related to site plan reviews, permits that the zoning and land use review sections deal with. And so that's what I shared. I don't know if that's what you folks were looking for in this dashboard, but I'll let Ross speak to more of the stuff that Development Services tracks that I think is closer to what you're looking for.
Great. Well, let me frame the conversation again as Ross comes forward. Thank you all. Thank you for bringing forward information. The idea is basically for everyone who's listening in on the line now, wasn't part of the first conversation, to be able to get some sense of information that's reoccurring, similar to other departments that provide updates on similar activities, a lot of consumer-facing activities, to be able to get a temperature check on activity, opportunity, and create a baseline of data so that we can also see growth, and especially related to increasing economic activity or opportunity in Anchorage. So the idea was, what does a dashboard look like for our committee? What are the data points that are available to us? So it's really a starting point. And so I just want to leave it there so that we can also have an expectation that members can take a look at this information, see what is being presented to us today, and we can help refine it together so we can have the public have a little more insight into a lot of our processes, and we can talk about it from that perspective.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and I think what I said last time is we're happy to share whatever information we can. We do a lot of the stuff with permits, but it's stuff that Development Services is already tracking. So,
Excellent.
but we're happy to help where we can.
Thank you. Ross, want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, this is Ross Nelson, Development Services Department. So the Development Services Department has historically provided a permit activity report that shows the permit activity, new permits for residential, commercial types of construction. That report's also on our website where people can go view that report at any time. We had staff turnover. The report, unfortunately, is not automated. It was being produced manually from information from our permit tracking software. And the person that was extracting that information and creating the report retired back in May. And so we've been short-staffed and haven't been able to get that report updated since May. I'm not sure, some of the members of the assembly are probably already aware of that report and read that report. Some may not be.
Mr. Constant?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think we're talking about two different things. One is maybe coming up with a more tailored report that gets to specific issues related to the success of moving towards more building and more growth. And I think that maybe if I'm understanding right, the report you're referring to is kind of that OMB driven webpage with the link, and we can go and look at what those information details you're reporting. So if it's that, I just want to broadly speak to members that system, in my opinion, is fatally flawed. That it's a tremendous amount of make work for department heads that no one ever reads, that doesn't actually drive any value toward increasing, from at least a legislative perspective, development in this case, or other departments in their operations. And so I have been looking at that system, questioning it, and why are we doing all of this work for no good? And when Cheryl Frasca was back for maybe her third or fourth time as OMB director recently, she was the one who created that system, but couldn't really show how it was working to achieve the goal it was set out to achieve, which was to make the departments more accountable and make delivery of services better. So that's a broad way of saying if we're gonna use our reliance on that system, we're probably hitching our stars to a failed approach. And it's not just your department didn't have someone this quarter, this is an endemic problem. And it's crazy, we get one link on our report that has like 75 other links under it to get to the fine detail of God knows what, and no one ever reads it. And so there's a broader conversation about how to take that tool and make it work. I think we would be wise to chart out a list of things we want to see measured here for our purposes rather than rely on that. I'm sure the department directors will tell you, what? You want us to look at making that go away or doing something different? That will tell you, yes, please, because it's dumb.
It sounds to me that you're referring to the performance measures
That whole system,
for the various departments.
if that's what this kind of is referring to, I think we should do something else.
Okay.
Yeah, Member Braun.
Well, I kind of envisioned when I was listening last time that it was like how many permits for ADUs were processed and how many new build permits, you know, just something, you know, for the layman to see that we are developing more in Anchorage, that there's progress forward, we're moving those permits through. But maybe I have a different idea.
No, that's thank you for raising that. No, what I'd like us to do is, who's gonna walk us through what we have here? Tell us what we're looking at, so that we can square it off with what our expectations are, knowing that we're gonna refine a direction, being able to get information so that we can translate it to the public effectively. So walk us through what we have.
Well, I'm not sure what we're talking about or what we're looking at.
So Ross, I just shared the PVR,
Yeah,
is
we got it.
exactly what Mr. Constant was referring to. These are the performance value review for just the planning department.
Okay.
I think what we talked about last time was getting together and saying, what, as Ms. Bronga said, what are the things that you want to track? What are the things that could be put on a dashboard that would show the information you're looking for? Because, you know, the data's there. The data's out there for all that stuff, but as Ross said, someone has to go in there and move that stuff over, or someone has to figure out some program that puts it into a dashboard. I'm not nearly smart enough to figure that one out. It's not my wheelhouse, but that's the data. The data is there. We just need to get from point A to point B. But the first thing we need is to understand what are the points that you want to, what do you want to see?
So the first point, let's just recap. And I appreciate you bringing us back to a starting point. So what do we want is a good question. And I think when we ask that, we then begin to understand the real question is, what do we have available already? What do we collect? And then from that, we get to decide, what do we need additionally? What do we need more of? So what do we want is also, the prerequisite to that is knowing what we have. So there was some discussion at that time about some areas of reporting, tracking, not with a complete picture because we don't know all of the questions yet, but this is a starting point today. So I just want to know that, what do we have today here so we can understand what this document represents? Anyone else want to speak to the other points of data dashboard possibilities that we have? That'll really give us an understanding to our very basic questions, because we can list all sorts of things we want. If we get them already, then we'd like to have them. And if they're impossible to gather because we don't have the other skill sets or prerequisite data sets available, then we need to know that as well.
Sure.
Thank you. Because there's a lot of information on this, and I have no clue what it really represents or how to translate it to a community council member or everybody else in the public. So.
Yeah, I mean, the stuff that I shared is the measures that the planning department tracks. That's something that Ross has some understanding of. I don't have a clue what that's not something I.
Yeah, just explain it for us, please.
So this is the permit activity report, comparing 2023 year-to-date with 2022 year-to-date, comparing this period would be this month basically April 1 to April 30th. Yeah, so this is more of a global snapshot of the construction activity within the municipality of Anchorage. This does not reflect the performance of the Development Services Department.
Member Bro?
Yeah, I have a question, or just thinking about these, so, because I noticed it's completing initial reviews, and that makes sense, you know, we want quick turnaround time, but I think the feedback I've heard from a lot of people is, and I know there's multiple factors, but generally, the time that it takes to, between walking in for the first time and saying, here's my application, and then when something actually gets built or something gets a certificate of occupancy. And I know there's a lot of factors that are outside of the department's control, but I think that seems to be one of the biggest issues that we have in the city with development, and so I wonder if there's a way to build in kind of more outcomes-oriented tracking. Again, recognizing that a builder's ability to finish a project is not just on this department, but that seems to be the issue, right? Because this is saying that there's really quick initial turnaround, but I think that's not really the issue that we're trying to fix.
Well, two things to keep in mind. One, this is just the planning department. So this, again, is just the initial review when someone puts a permit in for, let's say, a residential construction. And the zoning and land use review, what they're looking at is, you know, does the zoning allow this structure to be built on that particular piece of property? And that's a quick process that they go through. I mean, relatively speaking, a relatively quick process. Once that's just step one, and then it goes over to the development services, those folks in that other different department, and they're looking at it to see if the design. I don't know exactly what they do over there because it's not my department, but they look at the design and see if it meets code and all that stuff, and then they process the permits, and then they do the inspections and all that stuff, and that's a longer time frame. And I don't know what the folks that you're referring to are, when they're saying this isn't working like it's supposed to, or it's taking too long. I'm not sure which, part of that long sausage making process they're talking about.
Well, I think that's fair. I think that's part of the question, right? Is
Yeah.
if this isn't the choke point, then where is it? I think
Yeah.
that's the question to answer. Not right now, but to figure out.
Thank you. Yeah, Member Constable?
You know, the thing we always hear about, I hear that just ad infinitum forever, is, permit costs, all of these government costs are making our projects unaffordable. And they kind of frame it out in cost and time. It takes too much time and it costs too much money. And everyone wants to believe that because everyone would like a simple answer. So the question I would have is, can we come up with a cost and time frame per permit and then average it so we can see in detail and see in general what it's costing? So we can then have some truth behind the question of, is it actually a cost and time issue that's causing this problem, right? Because obviously every developer is going to argue, well, it's too expensive for us to get permits. You should make it cheaper, right? Anyhow, how do we know that's true or not? That would be good information.
That's interesting. Thank you, Member Constance, because to that inquiry that Member Brawley was just asking about, where are the choke points? And it would be interesting to have data that tracks progress in that way, so we can see where the added value and added time elements are. The challenge with that is I really want to make sure that we're not singling out areas or workforce and kind of telling a story that the numbers may say something like it costs more here, and there's the tendency to kind of be negative about why, rather than be inquisitive. So I just want us to be thoughtful about seeing that. But I think that's a really good point. The cost and the time frame for permit kind of get a sense. Because as we look at these things over time, we'll start to develop that intuitively. But I think that's really in the direction of where I hope this conversation leads us today, just getting a little more insight about the information that is going to be important for us to tell the narrative of activity, success, progress, challenges, and then inform us as policymakers how we can target better solutions or encode updates. Any other members? Ross?
So, this is Ross again. The real challenge with this is the process is so nuanced, right? We could produce data that said like, it took X amount of days from the date the permit was submitted to the date the permit was issued. It took X amount of days from the date the permit was issued to the date the conditional certificate of occupancy or certificate of occupancy was issued. So when you do that, like part of that time belongs to the municipality of Anchorage and part of that time belongs to the developer, right? We have no control over how responsive the developer is. And I can give you some examples of that. And if you really want to start mining down deeper and deeper, then it actually becomes more challenging and just one example is, one of the things that's going on right now in Anchorage is there's a shortage of structural engineers to the point, and I haven't seen this before, where we've had new buildings submitted for permit with no structural drawings. And we have a requirement that you need to be done with the design when you submit for permit. That, because we're under such pressure to turn these things over quickly. It takes us a lot more time to review incomplete work, more review iterations come through. However, we're taking these projects in with no structural design, just to get it into the system, to get it going, to make the customer feel happy, like they're moving forward. So then, the whole first review iteration the project goes through, there was no structural review. So the structural review took 0 hours to complete, right? Now the second review iteration comes in, now there's a structural design, and maybe the structural design took 4 weeks to complete. 4 weeks, you average that together, the first, middle, and the second zero, that's 2 weeks. The data's getting skewed because of the flexibility of the system and how we operate in reality. It's nuanced, it's very nuanced. And that's just one example. And then there's 12 reviews a new building goes through. So and everybody, not everybody, the vast majority is going through this electronic plan review process. Every time a submittal comes in, given the way the software works, we have to route that submittal to every review discipline, regardless of whether they submit to that discipline or not. And they don't do that. They don't submit to every discipline each time. They only do like partial submittals. Oh, I'm only submitting it to right of way and zoning. Everybody else touches that, but their review time is like 0 hours. So it's easy to produce big picture data, but if you really want to mine down into saying, oh, who's the holdup here, it becomes much more complex to mine down into that data. And I see it because I'm in the middle of all these projects, routing these things around, and I know where things are being held up and everything, but trying to reflect that.
Well,
yeah.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that, and we're going to move on. I just wanted to highlight the 3 things that I heard today, because this is, again, a starting point of moving information forward, and I appreciate you all taking the time for that. Big picture is important, so let's not lose track of that. One of the things that stimulated this conversation and prompted it was when we talked about improving the speed and effectiveness of processes. We talked about the computer systems improvement to make online access and things more effective and available to the public, which necessarily raised the question, how do we know it's better? And so I'm interested in the speed and effectiveness of the consumer-facing, the customer-facing parts of our element. Whether it's the front desk, if we're referring people to new online systems, is it better? Is it faster? Are people having a better time? I'm interested in the cost and time frame permit. I think that's important, and we could get a better handle on it. And really just getting a sense of what we have available in terms of information, how we can present this to the public. But it's also, I really am interested in, when you mentioned 12 reviews and some of the other things that I know that, we were walking at Mulcahy yesterday with, looking at little baseball improvements for the stadium, and Pete Peterson brought someone in who did work out in the miners field and out in the valley as well. And they just talked about how fast they were able to do the upgrades to the stadium that were self-evident and the improvements, right? And so when we hear those sorts of stories anecdotally, I'm interested in getting a little better handle of how we can improve our systems by having access to data like that. So I appreciate folks on this conversation. Members, continue to flag us in terms of the items that you'd like to see or consider on a dashboard, what you think will help us tell the story, and we'll continue to have this conversation with staff, and we'll see if we can produce some good information for this committee. Thank you all. Yes, Mr. Cross.
My experience has been most of the bottleneck is on nuanced construction or practices that are not typical. When anything's, it seems like building technologies and advancements are rapidly changing. They're already got a heavy workload, and so when a new commercial project or something comes before and it has unique engineering attributes that are not typically seen in acreage, sometimes that can take a very long time to get those approved. And make sure that the building is safe, make sure that we're taking the public interest into consideration. But those can be very lengthy delays if it's anything that's out of the ordinary. And unfortunately, those are hard to quantify because you really have to then take a look at the nuances of the specific project, and the law of averages doesn't apply. So, and it'd be interesting to see what that approval process looks like when you get into more advanced commercial construction, or individuals bringing up something that may have been done in 49 other states and not having an approval, but we come up here, it's not something we've done yet. That bottleneck can be rather painful. And so a project, rather than being approved, your law of averages, you always have those outliers, right? The ones that streamline, like pre-approved plans would do, that'd be quick, but if it's something that we haven't done up here, that they haven't seen, or we haven't had to, it hasn't weathered the test of time and further examination, it can be very painful.
And I think we voted on an item of that similar physical structure or design, and some questions about that recently. So I take your point that there are nuances to every case. I'm interested in the big story, and I hope that we're a city full of people wanting to come with new and innovative things to build, but I think the challenges are a little more basic as well. So, thank you all. We're gonna, on our next item of business, I'm gonna just ask the members for unanimous consent to basically change the order of the day to move item C under new business upward. So we have Senator Dunbar with us, and we want to honor his time, and we invite Senator Dunbar to present on SB 77, the Blight Bill discussion, and we're really excited about this in this committee. Hello, Senator Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. I apologize for jumping the line a little bit, but something came up and I do have to go. But I'd say, first of all, it's nice to be back in this kind of committee hearing. It's sort of interesting. It's a little bit more substantive and maybe a little bit less theatric than the committee hearings can be in the legislature sometimes. So it's a good atmosphere. So I appreciate the discussion here. And thank you for the opportunity to discuss a little bit about SB 77. I know some members are considering perhaps putting forward a resolution to see if the Assembly might want to support this bill. And certainly I would very much welcome that. And so a little bit about the genesis of this bill. I have been working with Director Robbins from the ACBA, particularly about Section 1 of this bill, although we've also been working on Section 2. And there's a number of materials that I brought, including a very large stack of letters of support. And so those are available online. I don't think they got printed this morning, but they're on the municipal website. Of course, they're also on the state website on the system that tracks the bills. So SB 77 passed the state Senate this last session. Passed through Labor and Commerce, the House side, and the Finance Committee on the House side, and now to the Rules Committee, hopefully going for a floor vote before the full House this coming session in January or February. Mandy, are you running could you maybe go to the sectional analysis, if you could? So this is actually the bill text. Why don't we just do the bill text? That's fine. We stay here on the bill text and I'll go into the first section. And I'll just say very briefly what these do. Then I'm happy to answer any questions. So the first section allows for a more thorough property tax exemption that will also allow you, the municipality, to exempt the school district portion of the required local contribution. Now, the really important point about that is it does not reduce school funding. So this is something we worked with the state assessor to sort of confirm. Basically, the municipality will still be required to provide that funding. You'll just have to provide it from slightly different sources. Most likely, you'll have a very small incremental tax increase on every other property in the city. And this is how these property tax exemptions generally work. If you remember, a number of years ago, we passed a property tax exemption in the downtown district, a 12-year property tax exemption for multifamily housing construction. And what happens in that case is everybody else sort of eats the cost. But then over the long term, this, if you time bar it, this large new property gets added to the tax base and everybody's property taxes go down. But what you're trying to do is change the economics so that we can tip some of these projects over into affordability. I should also say that with this section and with section 2, we aren't mandating the municipality to do anything. The state law is basically changing to get out of your way so you could choose to pass the ordinances if you want to. These are two optional tools that the municipality, the assembly, could choose to pick up and use or not. I think you'll want to, but if you don't, that's totally fine. But my view at the state level is we want to change the state law to make it so that you guys have the tools to incentivize development. So that's section 1, and I'll say that came from discussion with ACDA and Debenham and others. If you look through the packet of support, there's also people like Colony Builders, the Home Builders Association. They've expressed support for that section. Home Builders also, I believe, for the next session. So the next section, if we go to section 2, is the one that sort of made the headlines. That would create a new, again, optional tool for a blighted property tax. And I'll say again, it doesn't just go into effect. You have to pass an ordinance to choose to use this tool if you want. I think that you will. We have letters of support from the Alaska Anchorage Chamber of Commerce, from AEDC, from the Alaska Municipal League, from the City of Wasilla, from the Sitka, I think it's Economic Development Council, or Association rather. This is a tool that exists in a number of other places around the country. We try to take best practices from places like Pennsylvania and Michigan. Initially, this did not have a definition for what is blighted. So your ordinance would help define what is blighted, and then you could impose an additional tax on that blighted property up to 50% of the current tax. Now I'll say, that isn't going to make a significant economic difference for the municipality itself. This is not intended as a revenue generation device. This is intended as a way to incentivize people to turn over some of the worst properties in our city and frankly across the state. In fact, one of the examples we use is which I see is on your agenda, is the Northern Lights Inn in Midtown. For those of us that were here, like Mr. Schutte, when we were trying to get that property knocked down, the municipality had to do all kinds of creative things involving other properties and other parts of the city and sort of bending over backwards to incentivize them to knock down what had become a really dangerous property that was damaging that neighborhood. And it took years. This is a tool to basically encourage properties like that to put forward a plan of remediation. So again, the purpose is not to collect this tax. The purpose is to change the incentives so the property owner never has to pay that tax, so that they can start to remediate the property. The initial version of this said you had to sort of complete the remediation before the tax was removed. Senator Shelley Hughes put forward an amendment which I actually agreed with, I thought was a good idea, which was if you just have a plan and you take meaningful action, then the tax is removed. Because again, we're not trying to punish anyone, we're trying to change the incentive structure. Some specifics about the tax. Property, let me see, what section is it? Single family, there it is, section D there. May not designate a blighted property owner's primary residence. So again, the purpose is not to put people out of their house and home. It's not to go after single family residences, which are almost entirely primary residences, or many of them are. It's primarily to go after those larger properties, commercial properties and large residential properties that have fallen in disrepair. And my incentive for doing this came from, my new district includes Mountain View. I went door knocking in Mountain View. There are a shocking number of vacant units in Mountain View in these burnt out, dangerous apartment buildings, and many of which have become centers for criminal activity. Mandy, if you can scroll up just a little bit. So the version that, a little bit more, please. A little bit more, there we go. Okay, so the original version that passed the House, or I'm sorry, that passed the Senate, did not include a definition for blighted property. That was something the Alaska Municipal League wanted to keep. They wanted maximum flexibilities for local governments. However, my colleagues, and I eventually agreed with this, in the state House, decided they did want to put in some restrictions on what you guys can designate as blighted properties. So this is the definition that they determined. I'll just read this very briefly. So this is or. Any of these could trigger it being blighted property. So first, the condition of the property endangers public health and safety. Second, the property has been declared a public nuisance under a local housing, building, plumbing, fire, or other related code. Third, the unsecured, vacant, or deteriorated state of the property has caused it to become a subject of the center of repeated illegal activity. And then fourth, the property has been vacant for not less than 1 year and is open to the elements, unfit for occupancy, or a fire hazard. So again, section D is not enough that it's just vacant. It has to be vacant and have one of these 3 sub-criteria to trigger it. Now I'll say this is a floor. If you decided to put additional protections for property owners into this, you absolutely can, right? So it's a floor, not a ceiling. If you said, this is what the state says is blighted property, but we're gonna say you also have to meet these other criteria in order to be blighted, local governments are welcome to do that, if that makes sense. So you can add additional protections to property owners. You can't take them away though. You can't go under this floor. You can't make this a more aggressive tool than it already is. So that's the blighted property tax. I have a cheat sheet with, I think, 29 state house legislators on it out of 40. So we've had a lot of positive feedback on this. I'll say when I'm talking to community councils, their main critique of this is it doesn't go far enough. You know, there's a problem house in their neighborhood that they want this to be able to be used on. We decided to build in a protection for that house. If it's a primary residence, we might go back at a later date and change that. But for now, this is primarily for places like those burned out apartment buildings or the Northern Lights Inn or the Pioneer Building in Fairbanks. And I should say my co-sponsor, my cross-sponsor on this is Jesse Sumner, Representative Sumner from the Valley, because they have properties like this too. Every community around the state has these kind of really dangerous problem properties, and we are thinking about ways to incentivize their development. So with that, I'm open to any questions you might have, and I really appreciate you giving
We have a couple of questions, and we're going to keep it brief, please, so we have other things to report. We'll go with Member Bronco first, and we'll go to Mr. Thomas.
So I understand not the single family home, but the homes I'm thinking of in our district that they're not primary residences. Someone owns that home, but nobody's lived in them for 2 years, 3 years. There's one in Nunaka Valley, no one's lived in for 20 years.
Yeah.
And it's just sitting as an eyesore.
The way I interpret this, you could use this tool on that property.
Okay.
Now, I have had people express concerns about that. Maybe they don't want that to happen. If that's the case, you could build additional protections in the municipal code if you don't want that kind of property to be subject to this tax. But if a property is long, abandoned, then my interpretation of this language is it is the word primary residence. There's no longer a primary residence in anyone. This could apply. I could see a lawyer taking a different interpretation, but that's my interpretation of the text.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Interesting, if squatter rights apply,
Yeah.
does a squatter then be able to claim it as their personal residence and vacate this lot? But that's not my question. So, or point, I've been chewing a lot lately on the value of our tax abatement process, and Mr. Debenham really crystallized this for me when he's building luxury apartments downtown that he's going to generate great profit from, and is demanding that we eliminate all tax burden from him. And I'm starting to really contemplate what is the purpose of this process for us to give away these values and then shift them on to everyone else. If it's just simply because we want to see housing units built, I'm starting to see a flaw in our system. Because the simple argument of making millionaire apartments to make more millions on, we're not effectively using our tax abatement policy for cause. We're just making profitable people more profitable for a long time at the cost of me and you and everyone else. And so I'm wondering if we're gonna open up a conversation about eliminating the school district tax in particular, because that's a pretty substantial investment that we all pay for. Is there any conversation about requiring some value added, some give from the entities that are receiving these benefits, right? Because we aren't demanding affordability, not even one unit. We aren't demanding that these properties go into neighborhoods that need improvement, right? We're not making any demands. And so, for example, the Northern Edge or the Downtown Edge project, we're giving it all away. And these people are now getting a letter from someone who lives in Iowa complaining about their having to pay for the downtown improvement levy. They don't even live here, it's their second or third home, and they're not paying any taxes on it. What's the give that we're gonna start asking for people?
So, can I just want to, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman?
sir.
Thank you. I'll say two things. First, again, this provides sort of floor. The kinds of additional requirements you're describing could be laid out in ordinance. So, this is a tool that you can use or you can modify. And I think perhaps in Anchorage's case, it does make sense, like you said, to put requirements for affordable housing or whatnot. I think that the AML, the Alaska Municipal League, supported this version because it gives maximum flexibility for communities statewide. And maybe the situation here in Alaska, in Anchorage, isn't the same as the situation in Sitka, for example. Although, I mean, there are plenty of places in Alaska that don't even have property taxes, so this doesn't apply at all. Anchorage is certainly the sort of most important, or probably the most likely place that some of these tools will be used, but not the exclusive one. So my preference is to give you a broad tool, and then Anchorage perhaps add those kind of ordinances to it. Your point about, aren't we just helping millionaire developers, is shared by a number of my colleagues in the state legislature. And I'll say one of the reasons I think this passed the state senate is because there's kind of a carrot and stick approach here. And although they don't necessarily apply to the same property every time. And there were legislators that didn't like the first section because they felt it was a giveaway to millionaires. And there were people that didn't like the second section because they felt that it was too punitive of property owners, some of whom were millionaires. And so, enough people voted because they felt the total package gave gave these tools to municipalities to decide whether they wanted to use.
Member Brawley and then Mr. Cross.
Yeah, first a comment. I know, I think Chris and I are going to continue to have this conversation because I'm on the other side where, the purpose of a city is to increase your tax base. Like that is how an entire city's economy works. How we pay for things, how we increase economic activity, how we increase our property values, and then what value we're getting for that. So I think what I see that this is an interesting two sides is helping projects, basically incentivizing people to improve our land and then punishing folks potentially, or at least having that potential for punishment for people who are causing public costs, right? Like emergency services, police calls, deterioration of other people's property values. And so I think, what we're really looking at is the big picture of how do you increase your land value, and then how do you do that in a way. And basically we're trying to solve an issue in Anchorage, which is it is almost infeasible to build almost everything. I mean, it takes taking less return than what's in the stock market, taking really high interest rates right now. So I mean, the mechanics of development in Anchorage are just really broken right now. And so I think that, it does feel like a giveaway, but it's also important to understand that if we don't change that dynamic, we will not build anything, or we'll only build hotels and office buildings, which is what is getting built right now. We have some that may or may not need subsidy. But my question is, just thinking ahead to the Muni's work, and this is more a question for other folks in the room. So on the kind of the blight side section 2, that does need to be a thoughtful program, what that looks like, that needs to be designed into a new section of code. For the first one, I'm just wondering how much of a significant change, obviously the implications are big, but is it a big change to our existing tax abatement system? And I don't know if that's a question for the folks at ACDA or other, what would we need to do in our code to enact this if it passes, or when it passes?
particularly, so,
Mr. Robbins, would you like to comment that?
Sure.
We're gonna keep it brief.
yeah, Mike Robbins, ACDA. So it would take some adjustments to the Muni code to be able to implement this, as Senator Dunbar said. And you're not, the Muni wouldn't be required to offer the whole 50% for all of the school district. We could come up with some, again, this is a tool that gives us maximum benefit as a municipality to be able to use it. So the assembly is going to ultimately decide how this gets implemented, because you're the local control over this ordinance. And so, yes, it's going to take some work, and yes, it's going to have local effect, but that's going to be decided by you all.
Oh, thank you.
Mr. Cross had a comment.
Yeah, so I like this because it just gives us another tool. I think it's really interesting when we get into this that, you know, the conversation of benefiting millionaires or whatever that looks like, but ultimately it comes down to the performance of the property. Okay, so whenever you're utilizing, unless you pay outright cash for the property, which means your ROI goes down significantly, then your banks and your lending institutions are looking at these properties known as what's called a debt service coverage ratio. That is, it has to make a certain amount of profit after all the debt and expenses against it. And in Anchorage, that property tax is a huge factor. It's huge. And so this gives us an ability. That's something you're not going to be able, unless you're going to lend the money, negotiate a better deal on that loan, which is at 1.25 to 2% above the Wall Street Journal Prime, which means that a lot of these commercial interest rates now are near 10%. Okay, that's extremely painful. Plus, you have the utility costs, the expenses, the labor, the management, everything that goes into it. What they will tell you is that it's just not, Anchorage is, particularly you pile property taxes on top of that, it's just not a good place to invest. And I've heard that from dozens and dozens of individuals who are taking their investment dollars into other communities. And that's regretful. You also need to understand that in order for an individual, and myself included, and I'll just use Quantum Laundry, we did, and we had to invest millions of dollars into this. You realize that most of these, even if you form it under an LLC, they're looking at these buildings and they look at the risk, and they will come and they will require you to secure that loan against your own private assets. So to discourage somebody and say, well, you're just a millionaire, you need to realize they're putting their houses, they're putting their other assets and other things on the line that if it does not perform, they're not just going to lose that property, they can lose everything. And that's a huge risk. And I will tell you, it's scary when you're signing that and they're saying, what else do you want? And we want it over collateralized beyond the asset just to make sure we can cover our losses. So, you know, I think it's great that we don't necessarily have to use it. Is this a tool we can use in specific instances in order to create affordable housing and do that? I mean, I think that there needs to be some, I do agree that there needs to be some throttle control on that to make sure that we're, utilizing this wisely, because I completely agree with that aspect that if we're cutting somebody's taxes and redistributing around other people, because, property tax structure can be very painful. It's the only tax I know of where your income can go down and your restriction, your earning income goes down, everything goes down, but your property, your taxes will go up based on what somebody down the street may or may not have sold their house for. So there's a big question whether that property taxes are fair, particularly to older individuals whose income is going down and their houses are getting older, but their taxes are going up. So that's a whole different conversation, but I like the direction this is going for us. Thank you.
I just want to highlight, I'm grateful for the property tax exemptions that have been extended to seniors and adults. So thank you for the previous work from the Assembly. Thank you for this work, Senator Dunbar. The new tools are a welcome addition to our toolbox. We look forward to seeing this. We look forward to the Assembly doing some work in this lane. This is an important topic for us now and for this committee. Final comment on this from Member Croft.
So I just, two of my peers kind of come at me there, so I just want to rebut and say, you actually mentioned the phrase, what value are we getting for it? And really, what we're getting is affluent housing built. That's it. And so, look at the building permits and starts and conclusions of properties. What's being built in this town? What we're incentivizing, and what we're incentivizing with the tools we have at this time are multi-million-dollar major developments in which the units are selling twice and 3 times for what the median is. So that's what we're actually getting right now, other than the very affordable housing, which is Cookland Housing, and they're getting benefits, but there's nothing for anyone else. And so our approach is doing exactly what we are intending it to do by our actions. And I wasn't suggesting to go after millionaires and how they're kind of applying their own resources to building a couple of housing units. But what I am saying is we are building a town for the rich, and our incentivization is doing that. And so, and they're being owned by people who don't even live here. And so we must walk carefully in this arena, because I think the time when we were just blanket giving it to everybody because we need to just get housing started is creating the problem, reinforcing the problem, not moving us past the problem.
Thank you, Member Constant. Thank you, Senator Dunbar, for your time, and thank you for the work on this particular item. Our next order of business is back to A. I have a comment on that, and then we'll move on because we will not have that full discussion today on item A. And so first, this spring, the Assembly hosted, so it's a great transition, thank you, Member Constant. This spring, the Assembly hosted a housing retreat, and we gathered with scores of community members, including business leaders, builders, subject matter experts, developers, policy wonks, and housing advocates to support the Assembly's Housing Action Initiative. Through collaboration with the attendees, we identified various tactics to increase our housing stock and grouped them into 4 strategic categories. Those groups were zoning, incentives, reducing barriers, and lastly, capital funding and infrastructure. Before our next meeting, which is September 26th, we are going to do some due diligence in vetting a significant amount of data that we've gathered through the housing retreat, through the survey and the day of facilitation, as well as going through the Anchorage 2040 land use plan and identify a blueprint for encouraging housing choice that captures the synergy between our work and those tactics. I guess it's the 21st.
21st for us, 26th is this.
Yeah, so we'll present some of this work at our next meeting here as a precursor to the coming up Fall Housing Summit. And the idea, again, I'm going to be leading the Capital Funding and Infrastructure Strategy Group for the Housing Summit coming up. And item A today would have been a discussion on tax abatement and reinvestment focus area discussion, which we will wrap into our September 21st conversation for the Housing Summit, as this is one of those areas of a strategy that dovetails really well. So on that note, we're moving forward on this item, and we are now at B. And so we'll go to, if there's any updates from Dean Gates, Council Gates, on the 3 and 4-plex expansion. Or any updates from you, sir?
We're making some progress here, and we're very close. But one mistake here on the agenda, it says introduced date 22. We didn't have an ordinance introduced yet. It was for the Oak Group, and I think bring it to the county. So we have 2 ordinances, one for amending Title 21 and one for Title 23. Anyways, I would just ask that we put this off to the next county meeting, and that we should have our complete drafts then.
Wonderful. So it was been requested that we put this off. We'll have the actual items before us to be able to review at our next committee meeting on September 21st.
Well, I'm sorry, September 21st is the next meeting. I'm actually on leave from the 10th to 21st. So I don't know if that's going to be possible for me. The first October meeting.
That's fine too?
Okay, for the 3 and 4-plex?
Yes, unless we have a time schedule that we're trying to match. Hold on a second.
Yeah, I think it would be better to have it introduced as soon as we can, and then if it needs to be amended or adjusted, do that, only because we have some important matters.
So would it be, to make sure that we can get that introduced sooner than later, would it be more appropriate to just move the September meeting rather than wait another 2 weeks? He's gonna be back on the 21st, we just extended to the first, To a time when he's back.
I don't think we should move our committee meeting
What?
forward.
No, I just think the item, we need to get it in and move it.
Yeah.
Well, the items, I think, these are very sort of technical code amendments, and for me, introducing them and doing adjustments later, it's a little bit messy. My preference is our work group with some of our subject matter experts, like development services, and make sure we got these things technically correct and what I've been drafting. It fits within our Title 23 building code structure. So my preference would be to get that done, but I understand what your point is, Constant, get introduced sooner rather than later. We could try to introduce on 26th. I think what makes sense to me is our work group say these drafts are good to go and then introduce. So I really need that to happen.
So I think I would suggest, Mr. Cross, you're on that project.
Yeah.
I think the work group should have a conversation about timelines.
Okay. As soon as we see the draft from Dean, then we'll, obviously have to digest that, and we have to respect his workload.
All right, thank you. Dean, we'll look forward to that coming from the work group. Oh, we have a comment from Chris.
Thank you. Chris Schutte, traffic consultant, member of the Tri-4plex working group. My recollection, and the sponsor can correct me if I'm wrong, but our intent was to allow the Title 21 ordinance to go through the Planning and Zoning Commission review process as well. So just to underscore both members' points about time is sort of the essence, I would suggest that once that ordinance is in final form and the committee has signed off on it, we get that process started as quickly as possible.
Excellent.
Great. Thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Schutte.
Mr. Schute's correct. The Title 21 amendments, those are almost ready. We just had a few edits from our last meeting. The Title 23, we need the work group to look at, I think, before we move it forward for introduction, but we're very close. I believe the Title 21 ordinance, we could move it forward to the planning department to put before the Planning and Zoning Commission very soon.
Oh, if I may add.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm pretty anxious to get this one moved. I think of all the things that we've done here in the last several years, at least for my professional experience, this is one of the most important things that we have worked on that's going to help with what we would say affordable housing. Okay, those triplexes and fourplexes, which are primarily owner-occupied, small investment properties that allow utilization on our smaller multifamily lots that are already zoned appropriately, and giving those incentives for builders to build to the zoned density rather than underbuild intentionally to avoid those costs. So I think in light of everything we've done, this one thing is the 900-pound gorilla for resolving a lot of issues, just because owner-occupied financing on it makes it so easy. It's the best kind of financing, and it not only provides a house for somebody, but it provides 1 to 3 additional affordable renting units for the individuals, who are owner-occupying that property. So, don't let my eagerness to get this, to see this through, for any important timelines or any procedures, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. Thank you, Mr. Gates. We look forward to that work coming forward. Just at this time, I want to just pause and ask I just want to know if there are any members of the audience here in person that are interested in speaking during our audience participation. If there are any members on the phone, I'd love to know that as well. Okay, great. I don't hear any. We'll move forward from that, and we'll go back to on the new business D and E, back to back, and they're both with co-hosted by 2 familiar faces. So we'll start off and turn it over to Lance Wilbur.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. For maybe some new members, I'll give a sort of a summary, and I appreciate the committee and putting this on the agenda as a way, because we have 2 ordinances that we're introducing to the Assembly on next Tuesday night to take actions on both item 3D, which is an expansion of the currently designated Spenard deteriorated property, and we'll talk a little bit about that, Also to basically keep the same locations but extend the time frame on 2 pieces of property at Block 41 downtown and the Northern Lights Inn. So I just wanted to bring it to you, and I'll summarize why we're doing what we're doing. I've got obviously Mr. Schutte here. We've got representatives from the folks at Block 41, and I've also got Jackie Davis from the appraiser. So when we look at these individual pieces when we see these requests, there's 3 or 4 individuals in 4 departments that are primarily involved in the review, whether they're creation or extension. One of them is Community Development Department, the other is the CFO Department, Property Appraisal, and the Legal Department. Because we are looking to make sure that the request is being made is meeting current state and local ordinances that we have. And just as a reminder to the Assembly, similar to Senator Dunbar, the legislature passed a statute that allowed the municipality to take these types of actions. It allows us to basically partially or totally exempt some properties that are some types of deteriorated property from taxation up to 10 years. And it also allows us to defer property tax payment on some or all types of deteriorated properties. And then the Assembly then refined that to identify some specific types of activities that could be done. And that was done under Municipal Code 1235 that allowed us to basically provide the abatement and deferral. So what a tax deteriorated property does is it allows a property owner to apply for tax abatement. It doesn't automatically grant it. And so that's a really important thing. So it gives them the opportunity to do so. That then also has to go through a review to make sure that they're meeting the requirements based on the current conditions of the property and the unique circumstances of the property and plans of development for that property. So you will see in both of these ordinances that similar description. I mean, I won't go into sort of each one of those, but in the particular part of the Spenard area, that area had already been designated. And it is an area that is basically along 36th Avenue between Arctic and Spenard. It's just on the south side of 36th. That's the primary area of the Spenard area. We've got a request. Mr. Schutte came in and visited with us a couple months ago, and he asked us to consider extending the Spenard deteriorated property area basically further south. That would basically be in alignment with 40th Avenue. So if you went from 36th to generally almost to 40th, and for those who are familiar with Arctic, that's basically where 40th goes across the jet, and then it would basically a straight line to Minnesota. So we took a look at those, and I say we, I mean property appraisal, community development, legal, and the CFO to look at what was different or unique or similar about those properties to the area that's already designated. Is there an opportunity to allow for, or is there a need to do potential tax abatement in those areas? Through an analysis of all of that, and it's described in our ordinance, we believe it is. And so we would ask that the Assembly consider that extension of the service area. And I know in our conversations with Mr. Schutte, I think there's been some work with the community councils on this, so this is not going to be a surprise to them. So in an essence of time, I will stop right there with my sort of purpose of why I'm here today, and I'll allow Mr. Schutte to offer some of that, so give us a little time to talk about 3E. So, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay with you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Chris, did you want to add anything, or is that good enough?
Through the chair, Chris Schutte. No, just to add that the genesis of this was a development opportunity on 4 parcels across the street from the previously approved deteriorated area. And the conversation that started initially was, could those properties be included? That opened the door to the more deliberative process that Mr. Wilbur described, which is, let's take a holistic look at the central Spenard area writ large and see if more than just 4 properties need to be considered. So there was some comparisons against the criteria and code, and lo and behold, the proposed expansion area that Mr. Wilbur put forward is significantly larger and encompasses a great portion of central Spenard area around the Fish Creek, former Fish Creek drainage.
Member Roll?
Yeah, just a question. So, because I actually used to live in that area, so I'm very familiar with how deteriorated parts of it are. Not to denigrate people who are living there that have nice houses, but does this affect the development that's already happening with Cook Inlet Housing? So I know they finished some properties and then they're working on others. Okay, so it's really outside of that existing development.
Thank you.
I would offer the last time we took this question up, we expanded it to incorporate that property. So this will be round 3.
Through the chair, sort of, yeah. So Cook Inlet, major projects that you see, Spenard East Phase 1 and Phase 2, those were included in the original area. There was a modification made for, because those projects were made up of multiple single parcels and there was a need to consolidate. Long story short, there was just a minor mod needed. But the overall boundaries of the central Spenard deteriorated area have not changed. Now this ordinance will propose to expand those boundaries writ large. Has no impact on any current development or current residents, including Cook Inlet. Should Cook Inlet do projects in the future though, that fall within these new boundaries, certainly they'd have the opportunity, like anyone else, to come in and make applications.
I thought we expanded the boundary just around about 8 properties.
Through the chair, no, I don't believe so. My recollection is they encountered a challenge where part of the footprint of Spenard Phase 2 was made up of a parcel that was not included originally. And that was the only sort of material impact to them. But I don't think that we've modified it any other way for them.
Thank you.
Thanks, City. Thank you for that, and we look forward to seeing that on the docket at our next meeting, our assembly meeting, and to E.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before we leave Spenard, because I think it's going to be important, what we're doing on Spenard is their deteriorated property designation is eligible until 2035. We're not moving the date, we're just expanding the area. The difference in the next one is the only thing we're doing is extending the time, not adjusting the area. So for in 3E, we're asking for a time extension for 2 pieces of property. So in 2015, the Assembly passed an ordinance that allowed for a designation of deteriorated property for 2 pieces of property in one ordinance. So they are sections 5 and 6 of an ordinance that was passed in 2015. One of them was related to Block 41, and the second one was related to the Northern Lights in Midtown. So in this proposal, what we are asking is that for Block 41, a lot of the western side of Block 41 has been developed, where the KeyBank Tower is. So this is just an extension of the time frame for the eastern side of Block 41. And that would basically move it from, again, it was passed in 2015, it would go from 2035 to 20, I'm sorry, I think I have it backwards.
Yeah,
I have that backwards. Would go from the current 2025 to 2030, and the Northern Lights Inn, and a lot of reasons why we're asking the Assembly to extend the Northern Lights Inn to actually 2035. A lot has happened since 2015, particularly from 2019 during COVID. During that time, there was a lot of sort of slowdown in the ability for the property owners to sort of advance on their development, either due to, in Block 41, they had some work to be done regarding, they had an earthquake, so they had to shore up some things. That slowed them down a little bit. We've been working with a lot of property owners. We've been working with the DOT. There's a lot of utility complications in there, so that took a little bit longer than we had to do. And then the Northern Lights Inn, it's we're asking the Assembly to give the developer a longer opportunity to actually redevelop that piece of property. I don't know if they actually have plans. I've heard from folks, not the representatives, that they do have plans to make some redevelopments. I do not know what they are. So they are actively looking to turn that property over to basically something that would contribute to the tax base. So again, Block 41, the area is currently designated. We reviewed whether or not they still meet the requirements to be designated as a deteriorated property area. We concluded that they do, And similarly for Northern Lights Inn, we reviewed based on their request. They're not changing anything, and based on the conditions of things that have happened a lot out of their control during this time frame, that's why we're asking for the extension. So that's about as quick and summary as I can provide it. There's been a lot of work, and I really appreciate the representatives from the property owners, the folks at Property Appraisal, and the law department, who really sort of scrubbed this pretty hard to find out that they actually, what has changed? Is it something that they did or didn't do? Was it something in their control they just didn't act on? There were things out of their control and just timing, and so we'd ask you to consider that. So that's the short version.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbur. Mr. Constant?
So I'll start by saying, I've known the developers who own this land for a long time, and I really like them and respect them. And I continue to hear questions about what's happening at Lot 41, though I understand the work is continuing there. It just doesn't look like it because a lot of it is interior demolition, and that doesn't show the public thing is moving forward, but it's happening. But the Northern Lights Inn property is a real issue. It's now sat empty for 20 years, almost. It hasn't been cleared for 20 years, but we had to pay effectively $7 million to have it demolished. We have a developer who secured a property on the cheap, who then told us, in order for us to get rid of it, you have to pay tipping fees, right? So we were $1.5 million, whatever it was, a big chunk of money. We ended up forward funding. And now the property is vacant from then until now, and now the proposal is from now until 2035. I think that my friends need to help us understand much more clearly what their plan is to go from that empty piece of land that we paid to empty effectively. We help subsidize. We're not charging them taxes for it, and they're asking for an additional 12 years. And so that one in particular is starting to enter into the realm of one of those pieces of property that people are arguing we should tax to incentivize them to develop it, as opposed to give away tax value. And so, and I'm not saying that property specifically has been discussed for potential tax, but there have been discussions about a land tax, vacant land tax, because people are sitting on these properties forever, and that's in some ways holding us down. So I think that there's some explaining to do on that property.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Constant. Your point is well taken. And the differences in the two conversations I didn't miss that as well. I think the bottom line is action matters, and to put another dollar on that, the municipality not only forked over money, but put man hours, labor hours in doing that work to eliminate that as a blighted property, to demolish that a few years back anyhow. So there's a lot of labor that has gone into that. I think it's a real opportunity to have a better picture of that. Thank you all. Mr. Cross, on
I
this
just had a
point?
real question, not on this particular point, but I was just waiting. The Spenard area deteriorated property boundary, does that follow within, do those boundaries follow the opportunity zones that established by the state and federal government?
Yes, I think on the Spenard, actually I do think it does, yeah.
Okay, so I'm just wondering if when we amend that, then does that information then adjust an opportunity zone or what that was? I'm just kind of curious on how those two different, I don't know if they're two different maps or if it's just we're calling the same thing, we're calling it different things. If you guys know what the opportunity zones are that were established as a
No, it doesn't. I would say federal opportunity zones are designated by federal guidelines and they use their rubrics.
Well, it'd be interesting to see if we, the state and the Fed has already established things based on, average median household income, age of the structures and everything identified, what they consider, they don't call them deteriorated areas, but opportunity zones, and whether or not there's an opportunity for those could be extended to other areas that suffer from some of the same issues. But, all right, thank you.
I want to thank staff for presentations. We look forward to these items coming before the body. Thank you to the members for your thoughtful comments, and we will adjourn this meeting at 10:30, everybody.